Okay, here we go again with another edition of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup here, my coffee ready to go. And of course, we got another outstanding friend, colleague, and guest with us here today, Robin Parker. Robin, what we've been doing is putting these coffee talks together, Coffee with the Founder together to introduce our community, our family of WPC folks to the people in our network and who've been a part of the conference over the years. So we're happy, excited you can join us today. Let's start by just asking you to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, just to give people a sense of who we got here with us today.
Okay, well, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called the Beyond Diversity Resource Center. And the Beyond Diversity Resource Center does anti-oppression, anti-racism training. We've been doing that since 2002. And before that, I worked as a Deputy Attorney General in the New Jersey Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations. So I'm an attorney, nice person anyway, though, and really glad to be here with you.
Yeah. So can you give me a sense of the name Beyond Diversity? Because I'm assuming you had gave that some thought, but what does that mean? Or what were you thinking about when you came up with the name Beyond Diversity?
You know, Eddie, I wish there was something profound, but the real truth was that when a group of us were sitting around thinking about starting an anti-oppression training thing, we were doing some balancing. We thought, well, we kind of have to let people know what this is because we want to get people in the door. And we don't want to offend them on the one hand, but we also don't want to, we want to be able to actually do our work. And so describing ourselves as a diversity training organization would have meant, would have signaled to people that, well, you know, we were just doing sexual harassment, anti-discrimination training, that kind of stuff. And that's not what we were doing and what we wanted to signal to. And then my old friend, Nancy Mamus King, said, well, why don't you call it Beyond Diversity? That way, you know, you're saying that, you know, it's diversity related, but you're going beyond it. It stuck from there. So we became the Beyond Diversity Resource Center. And at least so far it's worked, because if people put in diversity, it's there. But then when they get to our website, they find out that, well, if you're looking for just the regular diversity stuff, these aren't the folks. So it was, you know, really sort of a little bit of a song and dance for us to come up with the Beyond Diversity Resource Center.
Let me ask you about your time over time doing the work. I mean, what's your sense of how we're doing in reference to doing diversity work, beyond diversity work, as we look at, you know, let's just say even the last 10, 15, 20 years of diversity work? What's your sense of how things are going, how we're doing in reference to the people you work with, the organizations you work with, so on and so forth?
That's a really good question. My sense of things is that it's like the American experience. Some things are really hopeful and some things are not hopeful. The really hopeful thing is that I've seen some change. Since we started doing Beyond Diversity, the word privilege, the understanding of white privilege, the understanding of white supremacy has gone up. You know, when we work in colleges and universities, young people already know what those definitions are. You know, they're woke, quote unquote. And so it is no big deal. 30 years ago, the idea of privilege was a new idea and people were debating about it and all of that stuff. So I see us making progress. You know, I've seen the White Privilege Conference grow. I think I first came to WPC, it was either 2 or 3 where there was just a couple hundred people, and now you have thousands, literally thousands of people come every year. When we were in Philadelphia, you had to turn some folks away, right? Because there just wasn't enough room in the hotel. So I think all of those are really hopeful signs. The downside is that, and I think this is true in America, that as things begin to change, we get pushback. Perhaps one of the biggest pushbacks is going from electing Barack Obama to electing Donald Trump, for example. And I say that not to be so political, but to give an example of how the country was marching towards something more progressive with him, and then took huge, what I would call a significant step back with Donald Trump around progressive issues. So, and we hear the rise of hate groups and things like that as well. Unfortunately, that's the American experience. It's always a mixture, and it's always, what's the word that I'm looking for? A somewhat tortured way forward. So I am hopeful, but sometimes some of the stuff just shocks me. I was watching the news and reading about the rise of militia groups in the country, and thinking to myself, boy, oh boy, when I was in the Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations, that was going on 30 years ago, and we're back at it again. So I choose, as I'm sure you do, to focus on the hopeful, because that keeps me going. My people always focus on the hopeful, even when there didn't seem to be any hope. But I have to keep in mind how we're maybe taking steps back every now and then and trying to stay in the fight. Boy, that was a long answer, wasn't it?
No, that's helpful. I mean, it just makes you reflect, because it's been, like you said, 30 years. You think about the work of diversity that started at work and where we are today. I just think it's important to do an evaluation assessment. So that's really helpful. I was wondering, I mean, most people I see that move into this work, transition into this work, particularly from a consulting organization, usually come out of higher ed, maybe some corporate America, possibly. So what's the journey coming out of, law school to where you are now? What sparked that, or gave you the idea around that? How did that transition happen?
Yeah, again, I wish I could say that something profound happened, but I fell into it. I was just working as an attorney in New Jersey. I was in the New Jersey Attorney General's office, first working in appellate, and then I was asked to apply for the New Jersey Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations. And I didn't really want to do it. I was really happy doing appellate work, but they pushed and they pushed. And the other real truth is that they needed somebody to run the office that had a criminal background, not committing crime, but prosecuting crime background, which I had in the appellate section. And I think they also wanted a person of color to run it for obvious reasons. So I took it. And the part of the job that I found the most interesting was not the legal part. The legal part was relatively easy, but the community relations part. We had to do community relations as well, which means I had to get out there, help people start human relations commissions. I had to do diversity training, which I had no idea about. My father had done it as a consultant, and well, because it was my father and I was a teenager, I wasn't interested at all. That was his thing. And all of a sudden it was like, well, we have to figure out diversity training. What happened for me was that I found that the challenge of doing diversity training, sitting in a circle, talking to people across racial lines, was really scary, but really a lot of fun. And I was attracted to it. I wanted to keep working in it. I wanted to help communities that were dealing with anti-Semitism and racism. And so I ultimately decided that, I said to myself, wouldn't it be great if I could do this as part of my profession later on? Not knowing, of course, how little it paid and how hard it would be to make a living. But, I was stupid, and so I went ahead with it anyway. And that was really how Beyond Diversity was born. I said, with the help of Pam Chambers, who I think you're going to be talking to at another time, we said, well, let's give it a shot. And so we started the nonprofit, and we started to do just the community relations part that I did in the Office of Bias Crime. I soon learned the financial realities of that, which are that, although people love free training and are willing to come when you can give them things at low cost, it's another issue to get people in the door when they have to pay. So there was a big learning curve in my 20 years of doing it since 2002. But it's been a wonderful journey. I think that I've grown. Certainly my literacy around this has grown. And I've changed. I used to live and breathe this all the time. I'm surprised I still have any friends. I was always talking about race. It's like always, 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 always. But people stuck with me, and I began to get a better balance as I got into the job and moved forward. So thanks for asking me. People usually don't ask how, an attorney got into this. It's been kind of nice because even though attorneys are pretty much reviled, having worked in the Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations has helped open some doors for Beyond Diversity that wouldn't happen if I didn't have those credentials. So it's been nice. And I try to stay humble, around all of that. And the reason I stay humble is that, as you well know, the tough part about doing this work, any kind of diversity work, is that I'm always learning and always changing. Just in the past few years, getting up to speed on issues of gender and gender identity has been, for example, a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, just some of the newer aspects of the work that those of us in the work are having to do some learning about and some training about. So I want to ask you a little bit more, to expand a little bit more around what are some of the issues you find yourself, having to do some additional learning. So, but before you do that, I want to ask you about the beyond diversity, because often I feel like the next step that we got to begin to do some work around are related to some of the issues you mentioned earlier: white supremacy, white privilege, oppression, so on and so forth. What's been your experience around people being receptive to go beyond diversity, which sometimes can be just some of the early stages of the learning, which I think are important. So Can you just talk a little bit about what have been some of your challenges in reference to going beyond?
Sure. The beyond part is beginning to move away from the heroes and holidays stuff of diversity. When we talk about sort of normal or regular diversity training, I'm thinking of actually what is very important: the work of teaching people not to violate the various laws against discrimination. Right? That seems to be in every corporate wheelhouse. And I don't have to tell you, you get the video, you tell people, this is harassment, don't do that. You need to be respectful, blah, blah, blah. And usually when people go through that, they're really bored. They have to sign a paper saying that they've got the training every year. And that's the end of it. The beyond part for us is beginning to talk about the isms. the systemic oppression of people that exists in our society. And the reason that's hard is that, in my view, Americans don't want to think of their country as a place that fosters oppression. You know, it's not part of our mythology. Despite, slavery, despite some of the things that are going on even today around immigration, Americans push away from the notion that the country is involved in any kind of ism, or that they as individuals are culpable in any way around that. You know, there's always some big force out there that is just involved in prejudice. So my answer to your question is that the challenge is to get people to, on the one hand, understand that oppression exists in the United States. You know, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of that. And second, after you've done that, to convince them that it is not something that simply lives outside by some horrible force, by some man in a high castle, but that is something that we all participate in one way or another and have a responsibility to undo. That's a big mind shift for many people, especially people who, like me, are old, especially for people who are part of the mainstream. If you're white, especially if you are male, for example, that may not really feel to you like there is oppression. So the challenge has always been to call people in, right? To say, this is what's actually happening. It's okay. Go ahead and freak out. But we want you as an ally to help undo this, that we, meaning the people who suffer from different kinds of oppression, don't want to do it alone. It's not simply about saying you're a bad person, but that we'd like you as an ally in helping make change. And so the beyond part is dealing with racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like, calling people in. And in my estimation, it's doing it with compassion. What does it really mean for me as a Black man to, on the one hand, call out racism, but also to understand that people need education? What does it also mean for me to hold myself accountable? All of that stuff that I know that you know. And that's hard. That's hard. Folks have gotten up in my face and told me that, you don't have the right to talk to me like this, and that's not true, and you're just all of that stuff. You're just harping on race. And I need to breathe and have compassion and explain why we all have something at stake in undoing both white supremacy and all other forms of oppression.
Yeah.
That was a really long answer again. I'm sorry.
No.
Let me keep this short.
Yeah, let me ask you just quickly before we go to the next one, because sometimes talking about beyond and some of those terms you mentioned can be exhausting. When somebody gets in your face and you have to stay composed, it can be a bit trying, let's just say. You also mentioned self-care, balance. What are some of those things for you? And how did you come to understand what those things are? And do you do it really well? Because sometimes I say it, but I don't always do it in the best way. What's some of your thoughts around self-care, knowing what it is, understanding what balance, so on and so forth?
Yeah. Because it can be emotionally challenging. And as you know, for example, if I'm talking about racism, it's not simply an intellectual matter. Racism affects me directly. It has affected my parents, my grandparents. If we go back 4 generations, my grandmother was a slave, right? And my great-great-great-grandmother was a slave. And her child was the progeny of her and a slave master. So it's been up in my face and part of my history. And so certainly when people poo-poo that and say, oh, what are you talking about? It doesn't mean anything. It can hit me right between the eyes. So What I've learned to do over time is to take a deep breath. I'm lucky because I work with people like Pamela Smith Chambers and J.R. Reynolds, who I can debrief with a lot. And I've also learned that even though I'm dealing with a really important issue, an issue that for some people involves life and death, whether they eat or not, I've learned to approach myself with humility and to the extent that I can not take myself overly seriously. So if somebody's coming at me, let them come at me. I'm just doing the best that I can, and I let it go. I've also taken up meditation. Believe it or not, I've taken transcendental meditation courses about 3 years ago, and that's really helped just to chill me out, and make me feel better. But on the other hand, Eddie, maybe you're like this too. I don't want to become so chilled out that I don't have any emotions, because I feel I can't move forward with the work. So in some sense, that tensions, in some sense, those bad experiences help keep me engaged. Not that I want to invite them. You know how that goes.
Yeah, I do. I want to go back to some of the things you mentioned that are, just things we need to learn more about, things that are coming about in reference to the work. The analogy I kind of think of is the police. I mean, people may have different perspectives about the police, but there's some things you need to know if you get pulled over, or there's some things about the law you need to understand if you don't want to get in trouble. I'm wondering around diversity and inclusion, what are some things that people just need to know they need, they can't do, or they need to understand, particularly as it relates to the changing of the work, the understanding of the work as we, really try to create an inclusive society? Are there some newer things, some new terms, some new issues that you found or that you're learning that's helping you to expand your knowledge, but also the knowledge of the people you work with?
Yeah. Well, it's always changing. Over the arc of 30 years that I've been working, one of the most poignant changes is the one that I've mentioned to you before, how young people are identifying around gender, how especially young people are identifying around gender. When I was growing up, I could always count on having only the gender binary. It's just men and women, boys and girls. And today, people are identifying in multiple ways. And pronouns, for example, are becoming something that we're talking about. What are your pronouns? How do you identify? And the like. Same is true around, great diversity around sexual orientation and sexual attraction. Used to be just a gay straight thing. Today, people identify in multiple ways, including outside, sexual attraction spectrums. We're getting a lot clearer also on how people can identify racially. I'm seeing more and more people who are Latinx embrace a racial background. Terms are changing. Latinx is a relatively new term. We used to talk about Latino, but we've moved away from that because of the male dominant hierarchy stuff that happens using the term Latino, and so we're marching into Latinx, just in terms of terminology. And I think that in general, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, today as opposed to before, we have to recognize that people are coming from so many different perspectives that they simply can't be pigeonholed. People identify as biracial and multiracial. They will identify in various ways around class issues, for example. There's a whole cacophony of things happening, and people who feel that how they have been treated in the society and who they are needs to be centered. One of the things that has been a special challenge for me in dealing with the issue of race is beginning to talk about moving away from a black-white binary. You know, when I first started this work, when we were talking about race and racism, that's who we talked about almost exclusively. You know, with a little mention of Native Americans, but we didn't do very much talking about people who are Latinx. We didn't do very much talking about people who were Asian, and all the various different kinds of people who identified as Asian and Pacific Islanders. We didn't understand who they were, their involvement in civil rights. And so I think that we've, on the one hand, gotten smarter and more inclusive, but I also think that what that has meant for me and for others is that we've really had to brush up our game, right? Because it's not enough to know about Martin Luther King and the things in the civil rights history and the civil rights movement that primarily focused on African Americans and Black people, you know, got to be way more inclusive. And that's hard because it means that we got to know more than we did before and know what we don't know as we move forward.
Yeah, yeah. That's good. I want to just ask you how you doing, COVID-19. How's quarantine time treating you? But also, you know, being there in New Jersey,
Yeah.
a somewhat of a hot spot. How are folks around you, the community around you? What's your sense of how folks around you are doing as well?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's ironic, you know, New Jersey is always the butt of everyone's jokes, even in good times, you know, the armpit of America. And so to be one of the major hotspots, you know, really just adds some kind of insult to injury. Um, it's been hard in some ways, especially in northern New Jersey. I'm living in southern New Jersey near Philadelphia, but especially in northern New Jersey. My sister lives in South Orange, close to New York. Um, it has been very, very tough, and many people have been coming down with the disease. Um, and there have been a number of sort of two people removed from me who have died. And so that's been hard. You know, I have seen myself go from an evolution of surprise, shock, feeling frozen about it, and then beginning to say, well, okay, if this is the new normal, I've got to figure out a way to move forward. Um, I'm 61 years old and I've never lived through anything like this before, ever. And I'm sure that's the case for many others. So it has been a challenge, especially since most of our work is not done remotely, or at least it wasn't done remotely. You know, we'd actually go places, we'd conduct a training, we'd do an interview in person. And so to find myself shifting, you know, now using Zoom and GoToMeeting has been strange. Also meeting with my staff only remotely has been really strange. Wondering about, you know, when is this going to end? If it does end, how are we going to renegotiate it? Has been strange. And I would also say that it has been especially interesting for me to watch how issues of white supremacy have played themselves out during COVID-19, especially with regard to um, people of color, specifically Black people and African Americans being hit especially hard economically and by the disease, and also watching what's been happening to the Asian community with some of the prejudice that's been going on. Um, you know, some of it really stupid, you know, not ordering from a Chinese restaurant because of COVID-19, making no sense, committing hate crimes against people who are Asian and the like. It has been very informative, unfortunately informative around that as well. So that's sort of a long way of saying that it's been a journey for me, and a weird one, beginning to think about, so what does my work at Beyond Diversity look like during this time, and what's especially important during this time to look at. One quick thing I would also say is that one of the things that we did sort of early on was we just invited people to sort of a fireside chat like we're having here. We just said, you know, on our mailing list, come join us, let's talk about what we're doing. Because one of the things that I'm relearning or re-emphasizing is that I think that the work of anti-racism and anti-oppression is human, first off, which means that ultimately we care for people, right? I mean, you know, I'm always telling people, you know, we need to care about racism and all of that, but all of that comes out of a care for people. And so what we did is we just said, let's do a go-to meeting and talk about how we are doing and support each other. You know, we'll push aside the teaching about racism for a moment and just care for ourselves. And that's been a real pleasure for me.
Well, I want to ask you about the next 10 years of you and Beyond Diversity as you look ahead. But I wanted to go back to a point you made that sparked a question about Asian Pacific Islander, API community, Black community, Latinx community. It seems like with this virus being named specifically the Chinese virus, is having a real impact on all Asian Pacific Islanders, not just folks who may identify as Chinese. And also, you know, you mentioned our ancestors, the history of folks of color specifically, and the survival and so on and so forth, but also some of how this pandemic is impacting our communities today and the disparities around that. And now we're hearing some reports of DACA and immigrants now having policies being really directed towards them in reference to lack of just resources and care. And it makes me want to ask you, I mean, do you feel or see some of the communities of color, primarily those three I mentioned, being impacted in such a negative way, rallying together to say, you know, if we're not going to get this kind of care from a larger structural institution, maybe we can care for each other. What are you seeing? I mean, what does this say? Or, I mean, I'm just wondering, I don't know if I made sense out of all of this myself. So I'm just asking, what comes up for you as you see this playing out and some of the things that we maybe need to look ahead and think about doing as a result of this?
Yeah. In my view, what happens when a society is what can happen when a society is under stress is that unfortunately there can be some scapegoating. You know, an extreme example would be what happened to Jewish people in the time of Nazi Germany, right? There was a lot of anti-Semitism already before the Third Reich came, but with the Third Reich, you know, scapegoating of people who were disfavored went way off the chain. And so you had anti-Semitism and a genocide. Although we haven't seen anything that severe here in the US, I think that that same thinking happens in part. So that when, you know, the president connected COVID-19 with China, what that did is it said, well, you know, it gave some people the excuse to embody the virus in people who were Asian or appeared to be Asian, playing on nothing more than the blandishments of prejudice. I think also that, so I think that there, again, welcome to America, there are two things happening. On the one hand, you have people who, in my opinion, need to do some better thinking, who wallow in that. And on the other hand, you have a group of people, myself included, and I'm sure you too, who say, oh, whoa, wait a minute. now is a time for us to come together. So specifically, around people who are Asian. I see folks coming together and saying, it's time for us to take a look at what's going on um, with this anti-Asian sentiment and use it as a learning opportunity, perhaps to reevaluate as people of color, people who are marginalized, how is it that we're going to work together, not only during COVID-19, but afterwards? And it raises some really important questions. I've had the opportunity to work with people who are Asians and anti-racist, who have talked about the idea of the model minority. Well, what does the model minority mean during COVID-19? How fragile is that? How much does that need to be pushed against? What responsibility do other people of color, Black people, Latinos, and all of that have to come forward? That's the challenge. And of course, that's a challenge that I love because that's something that I feel that we can do something about. So I believe that there are people like us who see the negative here and say, well, this is just a wonderful opportunity for us to make progress so that things will be better than they were before, especially for people who are especially negatively affected. For example, it's clear that people who are Latinx and people who are Black are more negatively impacted by COVID-19. And that's because of comorbidities and poorer health in general. And so we need to attack that problem, right? Because if not COVID-19, it'll be something else. And even if we didn't have that, it means that people who are poorer, people who don't have good health insurance, and people who don't have access to good care are going to die earlier. And those things need to be addressed. And so it gives us the opportunity to highlight the things that we need to work on to make the society more fair, more equitable, and less involved in racism and other forms of oppression.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm hoping, like WPC, we have a multicultural effort, a kaleidoscope, a diverse group of people, because I think that's what it's going to take to really bounce back, recover, and take action as we deal with the after effects of this time, this quarantine, this COVID-19, which still doesn't have an end date.
No, it doesn't. Well, tell me, I'm going to turn the tables on you, Eddie. Are you hopeful for the future?
I'm pessimistic is the word I like to use, which means I'm willing to be hopeful and optimistic if people are showing me evidence of stuff they're doing. And
Gotcha.
So what I'm concerned about is, I think it's a real privilege to be optimistic and you're not doing anything. You're just hoping things will get better because good-natured people are in the world. And I think we are in a time in which we have got to hold each other accountable for action if we're going to believe in things getting better. And so that's the way that I'm thinking about it. And this question particularly, I just think there's still so much we don't know. And I only mentioned some clear identifiers, but I didn't even mention allies, whether they're white, but also multiracial identity and the way that some people are mistaken as different groups of people, and also colorism and, the lighter, the dark. I mean, all of that I think is going to be on the horizon as we look at the after effects of COVID-19 quarantine. And I think what I'm saying is I'm okay with being hopeful as long as you're showing me some evidence of things you're doing.
Okay.
And so let me ask you this as we get ready to close out. What about the next 10 years beyond diversity, Robin Parker? What are you thinking about? What's on the horizon? You got anything cooking? You gonna retire? What's going on? What's in the future?
Well, I probably won't be able to retire, only because there's work to do, and at least for the moment, I don't really feel like I want to retire. I just want to keep going, although I may relax a little bit more. And so I'm going to stick with the work. One of the things that COVID-19 has made me and my organization wonder about is what is the potential power to reach people of what we're doing right now, doing virtual stuff. I have always been the kind of person that said, well, it's a kind of nice thing to do when you can't get together, but I've always seen it as limited, right? But now I'm seeing that people are actually doing whole conferences virtually. And so I'm wondering, I'm not saying I want to do everything virtually, but I'm wondering, whether that can be leveraged to bring more people in who otherwise wouldn't be able to participate. Beyond Diversity is only one organization, so we can't be everywhere all the time. There are monetary restrictions, and so I'm wondering about that. And I'm also, very much wondering about the engagement of younger people, right? People who are now in their teens and 20s, and making sure that they become just as invested as old folks like me in the work of anti-racism. I want to make sure that they've got fire in their bellies, that they see that the work of anti-racism is something that they want to take on as they move forward. Not just a footnote. So I'm looking forward to seeing that in the future as well. And I'm really looking forward to see, where America is after we emerge from COVID-19. Are we just going to go back to thinking in the same ways that we did, or are we going to look and see what's happened to Asian Americans? Look at the death rate that's happened to people of color and say, there's some stuff that we really need to clean up as a populace. Those are the things that I want to make sure that I want to raise hell about, if you will, and that I want us to keep pushing. Because although what's happening is a tragedy, I think that it also shows the things that we need to work on. And so I'm going to use that as a fulcrum as we move forward.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate you and a portion of Beyond Diversity joining us today. We'll get another contribution from Pam
Chambers.
Yes. So in the meantime, Robin, I want to say thank you for joining us. And it's always been great having you and Beyond Diversity support me in the conference, and I really appreciate that. And as long as you'll be a partner, we'll partner with you till the end.
Hey, we're here with you, Eddie, whether you like it or not.
Let me ask you one last thing quickly, a fun fact. You had mentioned something before we got on, and I want to give you a chance to tell us anything you're watching, anything you're listening to, anything you're reading. We're trying to compile a list of things people can do during quarantine. Is there anything you'll recommend from your listening, watching, or reading list?
Well, I've been watching a lot of Netflix, probably more than I should, and I've really enjoyed watching Schitt's Creek on Netflix. When I feel tired or down, that has been a wonderful laugh. And I've also been watching another Netflix show called Nailed It, where you have people who are amateur bakers trying to replicate masterpiece baker things, and it is just hilarious to watch. So I recommend that if you want to laugh, Schitt's Creek or Nailed It are wonderful things to watch on Netflix.
All right, we appreciate it. Robin Parker, you take care of yourself. Sending you love. Be safe in Jersey.
You too, Andy. Thanks a million.
All right, peace.